We're only a week out from Nadu and the grief bannings, and people are already calling for changes, that the metagame is problematic. I mean, energy is everywhere, and so is the One Ring, honestly. That doesn't mean that something needs to change. Honestly, Wizards of the Coast may actually have been successful for the first time in their implementation of a tertiary mechanic, which is, again, energy. And that's what I wanted to talk about today. What is going on with the modern metagame in terms of the combo decks actually having a bit of a rise, and obviously energy being everywhere, the prevalence of the One Ring, and how Psychic Frog may still actually be a massive problem, but maybe on the lens of Ragavan versus Nadu. We're going to talk about it all here today. Let's start off with a tweet from Frank Karsten. The Affinity Savant himself talks about how a week after we have Boros Energy, Mardu Energy, Breach, Murktide, Ruby Storm, Jeskai Control. I mean, if you really want to kind of put it together, energy is like 35% of the metagame right now, like 30 plus percent of the metagame. And I get that number from the Goldfish page, but here, if you combine Boros Energy, Mardu Energy, and what is it, Jeskai Control, it's a little interesting as to where things line up. But ultimately speaking, it actually is a really diverse metagame if you think about it. This is the winner's metagame. It doesn't necessarily mean that other decks aren't possible, especially considering the fact that, you know, in tournaments and everything, yes, Boros Energy and Mardu Energy are at the top, but that means aggro and energy specifically are at the top. Pretty easy, I would imagine, to actually tech against. And then outside of that, there's a whole lot of combo, because the energy decks, generally speaking, have a bad matchup against combo, which is why Ruby Storm and Gruul Breach in a way can be seen as a bit of a combo deck, but we'll talk about that in a second here. Let's go into the Goldfish metagame page here, where at the 30 days, we can kind of see where I got that little 35% number here. So that kind of 14%, that almost 13%, and then kind of the 8.4 here. So almost at 35% of the metagame, we have the whole Guide of Souls, Galvanic Discharge nonsense going on. But there's a little bit of One Ring here as well. Boros Energy, Jeskai Control, through the Breach as well. All using the One Ring, and a lot of the kind of colorless decks are using that as well. Amulet Titan still happening to be probably the most busted deck in Modern, but again, Pilot Error really keeps it down. But there's a lot of space here to move around and grow. There's a lot of key snipe pieces that a lot of other decks play. Like, I'm thinking specifically, well, you know, Mill is obviously going to take over a metagame full of control, but also decks like Fish, Merfolk themselves, like Tidebinder is, or Tidebringer, I should say, is actually pretty good. Flood Moon doesn't seem that bad in a world where different decks are looking to take advantage of their lands. Like, I'm thinking Eldrazi, Tron, Amulet Titan. Like, again, it's actually not that bad. So there's ways that different decks can actually manifest themselves. I mean, Boros Energy really has cemented itself as a One Ring deck, right? It originally wasn't taking advantage of the Ocelot Pride and the Ajani Nakado Pariah, with alongside, you know, the whole Guide of Souls, Static Prison, Galvanic Discharge. But it's kind of interesting to think that, you know, in red, Unholy Heat's being replaced by a more flexible energy package that doesn't require you to manipulate your graveyard the whole time, especially in a deck that won't really fill its graveyard that well. Like Flage, if you really think about it, like, it's playing out a bunch of creatures. Sure, it's playing out some like non-creatures, but usually in most games that you're being aggressive, winning early to mid, Flage really only gets played once for its kind of base cost, and then maybe gets reanimated once, max twice if you're going long. Unless your opponent's playing a lot of removal, you're not filling your graveyard that much. So Flage is kind of just like a weird lightning helix with like upside. Like, it's like, yeah, it's an overcosted lightning helix, but in the end game, it's going to become a finisher. And that's kind of the whole idea here. But then when it comes to Mardu, it's not necessarily the same story in terms of being a quote unquote One Ring deck. Obviously, you know, you're playing black for a little bit of removal and the Fatal Push and some sideboard options, but Orcish Bowmasters and Thoughtseize also stand to be a very good option against something like the One Ring to proactively take it out of your hand. And then whether or not you believe in the whole Thoughtseize bug of the situation of whatever you take out of someone's hand, they end up drawing anyway. That's just magic, and that's just like the percentages of playing play sets of cards. But Orcish Bowmaster serving as the antithesis to the draw engines that a lot of decks are taking advantage of. Uniquely, obviously, Ruby Storm can exile the top of their deck, kind of getting around the Orcish Bowmasters in that sense. But again, in a lot of ways, having these black pieces, sometimes these recursion engines such as Chthonian Nightmare, especially taking advantage of the energy package. I've also seen like Ob Nixilis in one of these decks as well, which is also a really cool kind of mid-range, more aggressive sack piece. It kind of feels like Mardu Energy like almost plays like Rakdos Sack, but like you need the white to go wide type of thing, right? Like Rakdos Sack and Pioneer and everything. You're kind of pinging out like your opponent's board or pinging out your opponent's life and everything. It's all there. But in terms of these two decks, they play very differently because one is a one ring deck, one isn't. One tries to be more aggressive and plays kind of these pieces that are like an antithesis or an answer to what a lot of the metagame is doing, whereas Boros Energy just wants to be the metagame. It wants to be energy and it wants to be the one ring. But in terms of the next up, I would say like this one's the most interesting. Like Dimir Murktide, I'm really kind of paying attention to because of the fact that Psychic Frog feels like, as I mentioned, like the next Ragavan. Like, I'm not sure if Psychic Frog is actually anything innately busted in Modern. In Legacy, there was that whole idea that Psychic Frog could pitch to Force of Will and it could put pitch to Grief, but now Grief is gone. But Psychic Frog still is a very relevant threat, right? Like, Murktide is a very powerful card. Orcish Bowmaster is a very powerful card. You got Fatal Pushes, Force Negations. Like, this kind of feels like a Legacy deck light, right? Like, there are some evasive threats flying in the air, a little bit of graveyard manipulation, and the whole synergy between Murktide Regent and Psychic Frog that some of you may not be aware of, where, you know, you know that in Murktide Regent, whenever a card leaves the graveyard, Murktide Regent gets, you know, +1/+1. Psychic Frog can, you know, at instant speed with no cost, give it flying by exiling cards from the graveyard. So that's leaving the graveyard, kind of hypercharging your Murktide Regent. You're feeding your graveyard with something like Consider, you're casting cards like Fatal Pushes, like there's a lot of things happening when it comes to something like this deck. So it kind of feels like a more succinct version of what was Izzet Murktide, which tend to be a bit more aggressive and really rely on something like Ragavan and Dragon's Rage Channeler to be that mid-range piece where like you could kind of select for the cards you need, and Ragavan just became this threat that if you didn't answer, you lost. But now it's like, okay, I just even have more better threats that if you don't answer, you lose. Because Psychic Frog draws you a card, you have the removal, you have great top-end finishers that are kind of soft to some pieces of removal, but not to others. Like, it's not like Path to Exile is like a really big playable card right now. So to be fair, it hasn't been for a while. It's more so a sideboard piece. But again, there's a lot of options in this deck that tend to be a little scary. Now, of course, there's only like in this version of the deck, in the main board, you know, no subtle, or there's 2 subtleties, I should say. So in total, there are 14 threats. It tends to be pretty threat light if you think about it, right? Like and the threats tend to be pretty high cost. Like being 2 is a lot different than being 1. I hope a lot of you understand that. That's double the cost. So a lot of times it's really just 1 threat at a time, and they'll kind of try to protect it. So having that removal up is key, but a lot of decks tend to not do that. They, especially the one ring decks, they tend to rely on just being able to get away with removing 1, maybe 2 threats, then playing the one ring and trying to win the game from there. Dimir Murktide looks to stop that, especially with like Consign to Memory being one of the single best blue sideboard cards to come out of Modern Horizons in recent memory. Next up, we have the Gruul Eldrazi deck, which again is just another one ring deck, but taking more like the Eldrazi packages nowadays. If you're playing like on the ground, you're using Ugin's Labyrinth and Eldrazi Temple, just a couple of like soul lands to like power out a bunch of things. Like imagine a, you know, like a turn 2 Thought-Knot Seer. That's like a big combo. Obviously, like this deck, this list specifically isn't doing that, but a turn 2 Thought-Knot Seer is like pretty dang good. This right here is like Gruul Eldrazi, but like if you're looking at like the Through the Breach deck specifically, this is a Through the Breach deck. If you can look at Gruul Eldrazi, which is a bit more aggro. Through the Breach looks to like cheat out things like the Emrakul, the Aeon's Torn, and the Ulamog the Defiler, but the Gruul Eldrazi may be kind of a little bit lower to the ground and being a bit more aggressive. Ultimately, the one ring serves as that mid-range piece. It's not about like Karn the Great Creator to stop like affinity decks and then randomly look at, you know, kind of sideboard pieces that can snipe out. Your mid-range piece, forget your sideboard, it's just the one ring, which is good enough. It's at the same cost. Your opponent can't attack into it, and heck, it's like a fog for a turn. So the one ring still continues to be relevant, and the Ruby Storm just continues to honestly somehow be the combo deck of choice. And I say somehow because like this feels like the deck that people are most prepared for, but still manages to get there. And I feel like it's just because it has that potentiality of like the quote unquote turn 2 win, right? Where you start off turn 2 with a ritual into something like a Ruby Medallion, and then you cast some rituals and you start with like a glimpse, and like you really take it off from there. Like the potential for a turn 2 win and the speed of it, and I would say the consistency of it is, I guess, what really helps it. I mean, sideboard Veil of Summers and everything are really powerful, but it's really weird to me because the deck doesn't really want to go that long. Like, yeah, it has ways around the One Ring, specifically, I believe Alchemist Gambit, if we kind of back up into that. So during that turn, damage can't be prevented, so you take an extra turn after this one. This is one card that I got by in a recent league. I genuinely didn't understand what was going on. Like, I took lethal to a bunch of like goblins, and I was like, does that work? Because I played the One Ring, but Alchemist Gambit you know, kind of does that. I thought this was just an extra turn spell. I did not know that it kind of provided that damage prevention, but ultimately Ruby Storm is able to get around what is going on in the modern metagame, which is why I wanted to kind of bring up Suncleanser. Gets a lot of stonks right now. 1 white and 1 for when Suncleanser enters the battlefield for a 1/4 human cleric. You can choose one. Remove all counters from target creature. It can't have those counters put onto it as long as Suncleanser enters the battlefield. So like, okay, you know, you put it on a Murktide, it goes from an 8/8 to a 3/3. Cool. And then it can't have counters put onto it with the Psychic Frog. But really what it's here for, it's for 2 mana as a 1/4, which by the way, can't be bolted. So a Galvanic Discharge blank by itself can't kill this. You need another energy enabler, something else that gives you energy to kill this. Really powerful there. Target opponent loses all counters. They lose all energy counters. That player can't get counters for as long as Suncleanser remains on the battlefield. So that means that they lose all energy counters. They cannot gain energy counters, and this becomes one of the hardest things to remove for that energy player. Specifically being a 1/4 is so powerful, especially against like Mardu energy and like Orcish Bowmasters and like an Ocelot Pride, like attacking and everything. Like these things are like really hard. Like Suncleanser's, like, I mean, if you don't believe me, look at the MTG stonks page here. I'm gonna slow down my camera here. This card was like a 40-cent bulk rare, right? Yeah, it was a little high up here at $2. Oh, Modern Horizons 3, $2, $4. Oh, now it's a $10 rare. This card, huge stonks. Go to your M19 bulk, eh? Go to your M19 bulk and check if y'all got Suncleansers, because this card is absolutely insane right now in terms of like viability. It's a pretty good card. Ultimately speaking, is it the sideboard card of choice? I think it's like, it's kind of like the 1 mana colorless 1/1. You sack it for a green, you gain 2 life, and you can exile an artifact or an enchantment. The Urza Saga target of choice to answer the One Ring, essentially. Like, yeah, options come out of certain metagames. I'm just curious if Suncleanser is the best option for that. It feels like it is, especially in white. In blue, you can counter it with something like that 1 mana blue counter spell with Replicate. You can Thoughtseize it in black, or you can play Orcish Bowmasters to counter it. Green, you have that option of playing that Exile piece. Colorless, you also get that with the kind of Urza Saga. And then in white, I mean, maybe you're playing, well, you're playing Suncleanser for the energy package, but for the One Ring, I don't know, you're probably playing some other addition to kind of package along with that. But ultimately speaking, the modern metagame is full of energy right now, and people are breeding answers that have caused a little bit of a market fluctuation. But I think ultimately where I stand on this, right, with all this information, where I ultimately stand with the whole energy situation is, I think it's perfectly fine. I think it's actually really, like, it's really cool to see the implementation of a tertiary resource, like a tertiary resource design actually succeed. And I feel like a lot of people have been asking for this for a while. Like, they want to see mechanics like this come back. They're just kind of really scared when they get this whole like Modern Horizons 3 implementation. They kind of want to see the implementation of energy succeed through like standard design and everything, but like that may not actually be the best way to do so, because people get scared of when design works in like modern, but they're not scared of when design works in something like Pioneer. Like, would this be scary to you if these cards existed in Pioneer? Probably, I'm imagining so, but then that would also be probably the Modern Horizons 3 effect. I don't know if cards like this would actually be good for a standard environment, because these are like really powerful like energy generators. And I think, again, like a lot of them being more recent options is also a pretty telling tale. Like, it's not like we have all of Kaladesh like coming back with their energy generators and Aetherworks Marvel being like the new win condition piece or something like that. No, energy just becomes this like mid-range control value piece that you have for removal, for value generation. And again, I think it's perfectly okay. They had a mission statement. They didn't make Affinity super busted. They didn't make Eldrazi. Surprisingly, they didn't make Eldrazi super busted. but energy being at the top of the metagame, I think is perfectly okay. I think Boros energy being at the top is okay because it's an aggro deck that manipulates the One Ring and mid-range pieces. The One Ring, arguably, is the problem with this, not necessarily energy. I don't think Boros energy would actually be that playable without the One Ring. The deck is arguably a lot worse than Mardu energy without the One Ring. Gruul Breach is another deck that, you know, kind of has that big mana Tron, Amulet Titan kind of analog where it has some of the soul lands, it can power out a bunch of things, and then it can go Breach. And then Dimir Murktide, I mean, it's doing busted blue things. It's doing busted blue. There has to be a deck in the format that is doing busted blue things, and the Ruby Storm deck is ultimately just going to be a combo deck, which I'm again surprised with energy at the top. So like energy tends to have a bad matchup against combo decks. I'm surprised things like Esper Gorios and Living End aren't higher up. I imagine those might be maybe getting controlled by like Gruul Breach and Dimir Murktide a little bit. Heck, even Ruby Storm probably is just generally speaking faster. But it's again really interesting to me that decks like this aren't higher up. It's kind of funny to me that we see at the bottom here like Hollow One at like 2% of the winners metagame. Shout out to as an ex Hollow One player. Let me get some Hollow One players in the comment section down below. But I think it's perfectly fine to see energy at the top. I think where the problem lies is in the implementation of the One Ring. And you know, I'm kind of on that feeling that even as a mill player, the One Ring is probably one of the better correct choices to make. Like, yes, you don't have to play the One Ring. And I think especially if combo takes up the top of the winners metagame, I don't think you really need to. Like in this metagame, what I would probably just play 4 Surgicals main and like 2 Crypts main and call it a day, play Glimpses, right? Because generally speaking, like the average converted mana cost seems to be higher. Like we're in a really good place if Tasha's Hideous Laughter is hitting like 14, 15. And a lot of people are talking about in the mill Discord about how the Tasha's Hideous Laughter like calculator, like on averages and everything, tends to be like kind of like somewhere in the middle. Like I believe we're at like 10 to 12 if you take like the top 10 decks, which is not bad. But especially in a combo heavy meta, like if the combo decks are trying to beat the aggro decks, then I can beat the combo decks, and Crypt Incursion and kind of milling out options like that can help me try and beat out those decks. Obviously Flage is like my #1 problem right now, but that's why you're kind of mainboarding some Crypt Incursions, you're mainboarding Surgical Extraction. Surgical not only for the Flage, but also for cards that beat you and the combo decks. Generally speaking, I feel like Glimpse probably tends to be the better choice in mill right now. But anyway, that is my little mill aside. Let me know what you think about the modern metagame down below. Is energy really a problem, or is it kind of just the One Ring just in the back being the true maestro and the orchestrator of these issues? Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Have a great weekend, be safe y'all, and enjoy the modern that you're playing.